Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Citizen Voice and my teaching of the true U.S. history once again. This time we are transitioning away from the West Indies and the journeys of Columbus. We're going to be talking about the settlement at what initially was called James Fort. And I want to thank those people who are enabling this to happen. Wisconsin Christian News Network, where we are streaming live and also where our episodes are deposited in link form. We also thank the Strike Force of Prayer for depositing our links there. We're making efforts to get hooked up to other live streaming channels. Our events are also logged as links into the Citizen Sentinel Network website as well. So if you came via a flyer or just by word of mouth, know that there are other areas where you can get these past episodes and kind of catch up. But we have been speaking in the past few episodes, about 3 episodes, about Columbus, the effort of dealing with Columbus in reality is that the people who would want to look at the American history, the history of the West, as they would probably broaden it, they started with Columbus. Howard Zinn starts with Columbus. And so that's why we started with Columbus, even though Columbus never really set foot in North America. And in essence, the United States of America did not exist when Columbus was floating around the Caribbean. And that's one of the problems. This is a history that is meant to combat the 1619 Project, but if you will, it's meant to combat the lack of truth or the lack of sincerity in portraying history. So when we look at this, one of the first things that one of the first things that Nicole Hannah-Jones would like to do, or the New York Times, who backs her, would like to do, is make Americans believe that slavery was invented in the United States of America, and it was brought into the United States of America in 1619. But the connotative meaning that behind that is that the United States was the one who originated that. And in some of the first few episodes, we dismiss this very easily. But one of the other things that you need to understand is that the insidious nature of this type of narrative, it's very pervasive once you get into this mindset or into this perspective that, this is really the true history, but in reality, it is a narrative and it's not depicting true U.S. history. But once you get into that mindset of this must be the real situation, this is not history that the 1619 Project is portraying. It's a narrative that was composed by an individual, and it fit the narrative of, say, the people who would use history as a weapon, the Howard Zinns and his the people who followed him believed in what he was saying. And a lot of these people are Marxists. So what you're trying to do is deconstruct the true history and put it into a narrative, package it so that it actually fits into a neat little box that you can present it to the American people. And now they're presenting it to students all across the United States. So one of the things that I wanted to basically portray here, and as a carryover, because one of the things that I do as a teacher from one class to the next is I go back to the previous class and try to connect the dots between what we were learning in the previous class so that we can move on. So the thing that, I guess, the takeaway or the key point of that takeaway from the Columbus episode is that Columbus was really a pawn in a king's game. In the last episodes, we find that he's arrested, he's put in prison, he's put on trial, and a lot of the things that the people today, the progressive revisionists, are trying Columbus for all over again are the same things that they tried him for back in the 1500s. The problem is that they dismiss those charges. All of it was basically meant to smear this man, Christopher Columbus, who did the king's bidding for him, but then was essentially relegated back to where he was. He was stripped of his title, no longer considered the admiral of the ocean seas. He was stripped of his position as governor of these islands. And the family of Columbus had to go to court with the Spanish monarchy to actually get that portion of wealth that the king promised to Columbus and ultimately his heirs. So pawn in a king's game can be carried over also into this situation of the exploration of the New World, because who were the people that were financing the exploration of the New World? Not commoners like Columbus. Columbus was not basically permitted to do a lot of different things. In fact, he carried instructions from the King of Spain as to what he was permitted to do and what he wasn't, and as a representative then of the Spanish government. So we learned that he was Italian, that the Spanish nobles really didn't like being ruled over by Columbus, and ultimately they got rid of him. Now, in this exploration, they established the stronghold in the Caribbean, and they began to explore North America. Ponce de Leon went up into Florida looking for the Fountain of Youth, and then the Spaniards came across the southern part of North America. They went into Cortez went into the Middle American area and conquered the Aztecs. Pizarro went down into the southern area, into South America, and conquered the Incas. So the Spanish were extending their tentacles all over this area. And ultimately, this created a situation in which other countries were going to start exploring this area, which had never been, mapped out before. This didn't exist before at that point in time. The essence is that they thought that, Columbus and many of the people thought that they were in the Orient, but they weren't. And Columbus named the people that he met there Indians, because he thought he was near India, in the islands off of India. But this land that he bumped into accidentally, or without his real intent, this land was all Indian land. The Indian land existed probably for thousands upon thousands of years. And Spencer, if you zoom in on that, it might be able to be more readable if the people could see it a little better. But the Indian land existed in this period, and the archaeologists and the anthropologists basically say that this land was settled probably 10, 20,000 years ago by the Indian peoples who came across the Bering Land Strait or the Bering Land Bridge, as you say. And that's basically based on the ice melting at some point, or the ice being so thick that they could cross over in the process of hunting for animals for food. But the Indians would dispute that. And, we get into this thing where in history, we look at the either or reality. It's this opposed to that. It's either got to be this or it's got to be that. And we have a tendency to not look at both perspectives as possibly being true. There is a contingent of understanding that people from the Orient, they traveled along the coast, which was the case in those days. They had smaller boats, if you will, and they did not have the capability of carrying large amounts of food. They also wanted to get back home. And we can see that the patterns of exploration based in seafarers in Europe around the Mediterranean, the ancient Greeks, Romans, other individuals that essentially were seafarers, they hung close to the shoreline. The concept of a landmark is needed because they needed to stay near land. So the other concept of coming along the coast of Alaska, coming along down into the coast of what is now Canada, coming into North America, that's another possibility. and that's not explored. Now, the Indians also would say, well, you have your Genesis stories, and the ultimate reality is that we have our own origin stories, our mythology that basically talks about our origin here. And that's a third possibility. So when we look at these Indian stories, maybe they're not as far-fetched as some of the people would like to believe. We can look at the stories of Genesis as in comparison. Of course, the actual situation is that in our scientifically oriented and compartmentalized society, we have a tendency to dismiss mythology very easily. And that means that you would dismiss religious history that has been either told by people over the course of centuries or recorded in some way as the Bible was begun by Moses. See, the essence is secular historians can wipe all that away, and then they replace it with their theories of what really happened. But what we do know is that the Indian peoples lived here, and there were probably a minimum of 100 different nations in North America at the time. So the Indian communities lived, all over North America, Central America, and also spread into South America. And we know that, this was something that had existed for thousands upon thousands of years. Honestly, people really don't know. And when you have a scientist trying to explain that they do know, there is doubt, reasonable doubt about whether, they're totally accurate or not. They can carbon date all kinds of things, but honestly, for people who did not leave a trace, you would not know necessarily who inhabited the lands in the North American continent or Central or South America. But we do know that it was inhabited for thousands upon thousands of years. The essence of this is that it was occupied, and the Indian claim is that they originated in North America, Central and South America. That's a strong claim. Yet they would probably dispute the archaeologists or the anthropologists who would utilize the land bridge, but both actually can be true. The sailing along the coast can be true. People came from the Pacific Islands to South America, and the book Kon-Tiki talks about that, written by Thor Heyerdahl back, I think, in the 1950s. So the Indian people lived here. This is Indian land. And when John Smith came to North America, he came with a party of individuals who were going to explore. And the interesting thing is they didn't just cross, like, say, the Vikings crossed up into Greenland and then over into North America in the northern part. They came along a southern route. Basically, you can see that they traced what Columbus did, because most people didn't really understand what he had done. They were going to rely on the records of what he left. And those records were ones that we were quoting from when we were talking about Columbus. So he comes down to the Caribbean, they go up through the Caribbean, and then they eventually arrive up along the coast of North America. So the British were actually unsuccessful in formulating colonies there. I was aware of the lost colony of Roanoke, but recently I become more aware, and even in preparing for this presentation, that there were probably two attempts by the British to formulate some type of colony along the lines of what the Spaniards did in the Caribbean. The ultimate situation is that Jamestown is the outcome of this exploration. We do know that when the people came to this area, they were looking for a place that would be away from, say, a hurricane type force. We know that the people, the Spaniards and anybody that is down in the Caribbean, including the Indians, they encountered hurricanes. In fact, the name Huracan is a Taino Indian, Taino Indian name of the of that particular type of wind or destructive force. Huracan was a god, according to the Indians at that point, and the Spaniards just kept the name, and then it's been translated into English as well. The concept of a hurricane, strong wind that destroys everything in sight. So it's likely that they took the route because they didn't want to encounter, such a serious problem of a hurricane along their way. But they have to deal with these things. But they did want to locate inland, and so the area that they did eventually locate was within the Indian lands. Now, if you you can look at that first slide there of the Indian lookouts. If you think about the Indians seeing these ships, the party that brought John Smith over, this was not necessarily the first Europeans that explored that area along the coast of Virginia. So the Spaniards were doing a number of things. The English basically were trying to explore. The Dutch hired Henry Hudson, who was an Englishman, to explore for them. Champlain was a Frenchman who was exploring for the French. But who were the people that were, supplying the money and the wherewithal? The ships, the people that did the exploring. These were the kings. These were the kings who were exploring this. And so you had to basically deal with this effort of a king. Now, in the case of the founding of what we would call James Fort, this area, they had to go into this Indian land, and it was inhabited. The Indian shoreline was some place where the Indians would go fishing. So they weren't, they weren't unaware of what was going along on their outer, the outer area of the coast. Okay. They had canoes. They made canoes to go out further away from the shoreline to go fishing. They also used their canoes to travel up and down the coast. And these things are not necessarily explored in U.S. history of how the Indians were dealing with their lives at that point. But if you're talking thousands and thousands of years, they had things down. The picture here that you're seeing is looking at where the ship would be docked. So if you look through the trees, it would be the vantage point of an Indian looking at the ship that was there in the harbor. Now, this is Jamestown today. So you can see a ship there that's, a pretty good replica of some of the ships that came across the ocean on behalf of Great Britain in that time. But the Indians could see these people without being seen. And, the first thing that necessarily had to happen is that the people of the James Fort area had to build a fort. Why? Because they figured that there were Indians who were probably hostile. Now, when we talked about the building of La Navidad, which was the village that Columbus had to build because the ship was shipwrecked on Hispaniola. They say in the narrative there that Columbus left that it was a fortress, but it would take a lot of lumber to build a fortress. So most likely makeshift huts or houses, and they were in a hurry in doing this because Columbus needed to get back to Spain. So when the Indians are aware of these other people coming ashore, it's not just like they saw ships in passing along their shoreline. Now these people are actually coming ashore. And on the side of the English who are coming ashore, they read of what Columbus was doing, and they knew that there was a massacre of the people who were initially left behind at La Navidad. So we can see the interplay of the cultures at this moment in time. And I want to shift to the Sokotan village. That this was a village that was drawn by one of the early colonists at this point. And it shows the different organized type of villages that the Indians had. And they were not all the same. These houses basically, are a little bit like the round houses of the northern Indian tribes. There's an Indian tribe in the north that we will be talking about. We call them the Iroquois today, but they were known as the people of the long houses, the Haudenosaunee. But the Indians actually had many different types of dwelling places. Uh, and first, we picture the teepee of the Indians, and so many strange pictures in terms of how individuals depicted the Indian people. I've even seen the Eastern Powhatan community depicted as having some type of teepees because it's an image that people could relate to at that point in time. There were images of horses where Captain John Smith was captured by the Indians. They didn't have horses. It was the Spanish who introduced the horses, and essentially the horses primarily were up in the area of, well, they were introduced in the Southwest, say into the area of the Hopi, into the area of the Apache or the Comanche. And then they were traded with the people, Indian Plains Indians. But it's not necessarily likely that they had Indians all the way over on the East Coast because the English didn't bring them over initially. So the depictions in pictures or paintings that exist at some point in history, they're not always accurate. They're not always typical of the realities of the situation. And what would be the difference? Well, the people who were trying to portray something in their paintings, that would be their perspective and how they saw things, how they viewed things, and they were giving other people the image vicariously to examine and make their own conclusions. This happens even in North America. The painting of Paul Revere of the Boston Massacre, it depicted a message that necessarily wasn't entirely true. So we look at the different types of houses that the Indians used in all the different areas, and you can see that there's they're not all the same. But these houses actually they're found all over the North American continent at different points in time in history. So when we look at what's going on in the Native American villages, these people had a pretty organized system of farming, an organized system of being able to make a living. They hunted, they fished off their coast. Oftentimes, what would happen is that in the summertime, when it was really nice weather, they would go out and they would relocate to areas along the coast to do their fishing. In the winter periods, they would go back into the forest areas to have the trees protect them from a lot of the snow and a lot of the inclement wind and weather that would face them in the winter time. So they were a little bit more mobile than we can picture. When we think of a home, we don't think that the home is something that is movable that easily unless you're in a motor home. So what happened? Well, the colonists had to start chopping down these trees, and they had to create these fortresses or this fort to be able to exist in the North American area. And so what they did is they created the fortress. They created initially what was called James Fort in 1607. James Fort, as you can see in this picture here, expanded from the initial fort just along the river to include communities or houses. The community, would be enclosed in the fortress after they developed the fort itself. The fort was more where they would have the military contingent that would be used to protect. And if the people ran into trouble or, some kind of conflict with the Indians, they could retreat to the fort. But this is kind of going back into the concept of the castles in Europe. The people lived in the communities close to the fortress or the castle, and then they would retreat into the castle when enemies would attack. It's a similar kind of concept, only in the New World you have a lot of trees, so you build a castle built out of trees, which is a fortress. So James Fort, the essence is that it started in 1607. It is basically created into a bigger community called Jamestown. The essence is that it was a good port city because you could, sail up the river from the ocean, and it was right there. It was protected to some degree from harsh winds, not necessarily a hurricane type wind, but they had some trouble in the beginning of the overall situation in essentially planting this village. This is the third attempt by the English to plant a village, to plant a colony. And this colony, Jamestown, essentially it didn't do too well. There's a record of the third ship that was coming to supply them, and this ship was demolished in a hurricane. This was in, I think, around 1502, but the overall unfortunate reality is that the captain of the ship was able to salvage the ship by running it aground. Again, running it into the ground, into the land. And he was able to save, I think, over 100 people. And on that ship was a guy by the name of John Rolfe. His wife and son died in that. But the thing going on in Jamestown or in James Fort in that period, it was an expansion, but they were expecting people to be able to work the land. This is one of the key concepts here. What type of people came over? Well, we know that when Columbus came across after the first voyage, with the second voyage that was more of a commissioned enterprise from the king, he came with 17 ships, and they all had different interests. Clergy came, priests came representing the Catholic Church, the nobles came looking for gold, and then the conquistadors came to protect the Spaniards. Well, with the English, you have a lot of people who want to make money. So another gold rush to some degree. They were wanting to find gold in along the coast of what now is Virginia, and they sent people who were indentured servants to work the land, because by this time the Spaniards realized there was very little gold in the Caribbean, but they got real estate. So the other side of this is that the English learned from that experience there, and they realized that if they could farm the land, then they would be able to claim the land. And oftentimes you would have an indentured servant signing up for essentially a 7-year period. Now, this begins the foundation of indentured servanthood, which a lot of people don't talk about that, especially in the progressive revisionist history. The situation is that that created a conflict. People didn't want to work. People didn't want to plant and actually get their hands dirty. And so Captain Smith gets in trouble with the Indians. And this is the famous story of Captain John Smith nearly being killed by the Indian population, the Powhatan chieftain. Essentially, they had a desire to eliminate his life, to separate his head from the rest of his body. But in essence, this is where Pocahontas enters the picture. We're going to be talking about Captain John Smith next time, so I hope you would tune in to the program, the effort that we're going to portray in formulating true U.S. history. And mind you, the United States of America does not yet exist in 1607. So please tune in next time. I want to thank everybody for making this version of true U.S. history possible. Thank you very much for the production crew. And again, those people are hosting WCN TV. Thank you. See you next time.